The city that should not exist. If you look at a map of North America, there is no logical reason for a city to exist here. It is a precarious crescent of mud wedged between a massive, unpredictable river and a brackish lake, sitting below sea level in a bowl that naturally wants to fill with water. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, this swamp had become the queen of the South, the wealthiest and most vibrant metropolis in the United States, rivaling New York in commerce and Paris in culture. New Orleans in the 1800s was not merely a city, it was a fevered dream of ambition. It was a place where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and open sewers, where opera houses stood beside slave markets, and where death from duel or disease was an everyday gamble. This was the American frontier's great contradiction, a capital of refinement built on a foundation of brutality. In this documentary, we will peel back the layers of modern tourism to reveal the gritty, dangerous, and dazzling reality of the 19th century. We will walk the banquettes of the French Quarter, stand on the burning decks of gunboats, and witness the birth of a culture that would change the world. From the Louisiana Purchase to the birth of jazz, this is the story of how New Orleans survived its own golden age. The three-flag transfer, 1803, our narrative begins at the dawn of the century in a city suffering an identity crisis. In 1800, New Orleans was a colonial orphan. It had been French, then signed over to Spain, and was teeming with a population that felt loyal to neither, but rather to themselves, the Creoles. These were the native-born descendants of European settlers, a proud and insular aristocracy who viewed the rough Americans upriver as unwashed barbarians. The geopolitical earth shook on December 20, 1803. In the Place d'Armes, beneath the spires of the St. Louis Cathedral, a crowd gathered to witness history. The French tricolor, which had only been raised weeks prior after a secret treaty, was lowered. In its place rose the American stars and stripes. The Louisiana Purchase had just doubled the size of the United States, and New Orleans was the prize jewel. But the transition was chaotic. The Americans who flooded into the city, entrepreneurs, boatmen, and lawyers, found themselves in a foreign land. The laws were different, operating on the Napoleonic Code rather than English common law. The language was French. The religion was Catholic. The tension was palpable. The Creoles retreated into the Via Carrée, while the Americans crossed the neutral ground of Canal Street to build their own sector. This geographical split created a unique competitive friction. It was a tale of two cities, one looking back to European tradition, the other looking forward to American industrialism. This rivalry would fuel an architectural and economic boom that would transform a colonial outpost into an imperial city. The Pirates' Bargain, 1815, the city's loyalty to the United States remained untested until the War of 1812. The British Empire, seeking to choke the American economy, launched a massive invasion force aimed directly at the mouth of the Mississippi. If New Orleans fell, the United States would lose its western lifeline. The defense of the city in January 1815 fell to General Andrew Jackson, a man who arrived to find the city on the verge of panic. Jackson, ragged and suffering from dysentery, realized he lacked the manpower to repel the British veterans. He needed help, and he found it in the swamps of Barataria Bay. Jean Lafitte was a privateer, a polite word for a pirate, who controlled a massive smuggling operation south of the city. He was a wanted man with a price on his head. In a twist fit for fiction, Jackson and Lafitte struck a deal. In exchange for pardons, Lafitte offered his men his flints and his artillery. On the foggy morning of January 8, at the Chalmette plantation, a bizarre coalition took the field. Tennessee backwoodsmen in buckskins, free men of color in sharp uniforms, Choctaw warriors, French aristocrats, and Lafitte's pirates. When the British redcoats marched out of the mist, they were met with a wall of fire. The Battle of New Orleans was a slaughter. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, the Americans fewer than 100. Though the peace treaty had technically already been signed in Europe, the victory was psychologically vital. It consecrated New Orleans as American soil. The blood spilled at Chalmette acted as a binding agent, fusing the fractious Creole and American populations into a unified force, ready to conquer the century. The funnel of a nation, 1820s, 1850s, with peace secured, the river opened for business. The 1820s marked the arrival of the steamboat age, a technological revolution that turned the Mississippi from a one-way street into a superhighway. New Orleans sat at the bottom of the funnel. The entire produce of the American interior, Ohio pork, Illinois grain, Kentucky whiskey, had to drift down to New Orleans to reach the global market. By 1840, the city's port was a chaotic miracle. Travelers described a forest of smokestacks stretching for miles along the levee. Steamboats, painted like floating wedding cakes, jockeyed for position alongside ocean-going sailing ships. The wealth generated was staggering. New Orleans boasted the highest per capita income in the nation. It was a city of banks, exchanges, and grand hotels like the St. Louis and the St. Charles, where deals were struck in multiple languages under rotunda domes. This was the era of King Cotton. The white fiber was the oil of the 19th century, fueling the Industrial Revolution in England and the North. New Orleans was the spigot. At the height of the season, the cotton bales were stacked so high on the wharves they formed artificial canyons, blocking the view of the river. But this white gold was not harvested by machinery. It was harvested by human hands. The sorrow of the squares, the slave trade. We must pause here to look at the shadow that cast this golden light. The economic supremacy of New Orleans was inextricably bound to the institution of slavery. As the Deep South's plantation economy exploded, New Orleans became the largest slave market in North America. It was a grim industry that operated in plain sight. Just blocks from the luxury hotels were the holding pens and showrooms. Men, women, and children were trafficked from the Upper South, separated from their families, and sold to the sugar and cotton plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi. The soundtrack of the city included the auctioneer's hammer. Yet New Orleans also held a unique demographic, the gens de Couleur Libres, free people of color. Numbering nearly 20,000 by the mid-century, this class occupied a precarious middle ground. Many were wealthy, educated, and cultured, sending their children to schools in Paris and owning substantial property. They contributed heavily to the city's architecture and arts, creating the distinct ironwork and literature that defines the Creole style. It was in Congo Square, a dusty open space behind the French Quarter, that the spirit of the enslaved refused to break. On Sundays, allowed a brief respite, enslaved people gathered to trade goods and, more importantly, to make music. Here, the drums of West Africa were kept alive. The bamboula and the kalinda were danced in defiance. This rhythmic heartbeat, preserved in the dust of Congo Square, would eventually merge with European harmonies to birth the only truly American art form. The Saffron Scourge, 1853, while the city grew rich, it also grew deadly. New Orleans was built on a swamp lacking proper drainage or sanitation. In the summer heat, the city became a breeding ground for the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the vector for yellow fever. The locals called it Bronze John or the Saffron Scourge. It struck with terrifying regularity, but 1853 was the year the city nearly died. In that single summer, the fever claimed nearly 8,000 lives. The infrastructure of death collapsed. Witnesses described carts rumbling over the cobblestones day and night, piled high with corpses. Cannons were fired in the streets in the mistaken belief that the smoke would clear the miasma in the air. This proximity to death fundamentally altered the New Orleans psyche. Bred a culture of fatalism and frantic hedonism. If you might die next week, why save money? Why follow the rules? Eat, drink, and dance now. It was during this dark decade that the modern traditions of Mardi Gras began to crystallize. The first organized crews appeared, staging elaborate torch-lit parades with mythological themes. They wore masks not just for fun, but perhaps to hide from the reality around them. The carnival was a defiant scream of life in the face of the fever. The federal occupation, 1862, the bubble burst with the American Civil War. In 1861, Louisiana seceded, joining the Confederacy. New Orleans, as the South's banking and trade center, was the Union's most critical target. The Confederate command, however, believed the city was safe, protected by two massive forts downriver. They were wrong. In April 1862, Union Admiral David Farragut performed a daring maneuver, sailing his wooden ships past the blazing guns of the forts in the dead of night. The city woke up to find Union warships anchored at the foot of Canal Street. New Orleans surrendered without being destroyed, preserving its architecture but wounding its pride. For the rest of the war, the city was ruled by Union General Benjamin Butler. The locals hated him, calling him the Beast. He looted silver, insulted the women of the aristocracy, and ruled with an iron fist. Yet Butler was also the first to clean the city. He enforced strict quarantine and sanitation laws, proving that yellow fever could be contained. Under the occupation, the social order was turned upside down. The Union Army enlisted thousands of escaping enslaved men, forming the first black regiments, the Corps d'Afrique, who would fight for their own liberation. Reconstruction and Reaction, 1865-1877. When the war ended, New Orleans became the laboratory for radical reconstruction. It was a volatile, violent, yet hopeful time. For a brief window, the racial caste system was challenged. Black men voted, sat on juries, and served in the legislature. The city's streetcars were integrated. There was a genuine attempt to build a biracial democracy in the heart of the South, but the reaction was ferocious. Paramilitary groups like the White League formed to terrorize the new government. The violence culminated in the Battle of Liberty Place in 1874, a literal insurrection where White League veterans fought the integrated police force for control of the city streets. When federal troops withdrew in 1877, the experiment collapsed. The old power structures returned, vindictive and determined to re-establish white supremacy. The erosion of rights was steady and calculated. It was here in New Orleans that the legal framework for segregation was finalized. In 1892, Homer Plessy, a shoemaker who was 7/8 white but legally classified as black, sat in a whites-only railroad car as a test case. His arrest led to the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which codified separate but equal as the law of the land. The golden age of possibilities had ended in the iron grip of Jim Crow. The District and the Sound, 1897-1899, as the 19th century drew to a close, New Orleans found itself economically stagnant, bypassed by the railroads that now connected the east and west coasts. To generate revenue, the city turned to its oldest commodity, vice. In 1897, an alderman named Sidney Story proposed a pragmatic solution to the city's prostitution problem. Don't ban it, zone it. A 16-block area behind the French Quarter was designated as the only place where prostitution was legal. They called it Storyville. It became a neon-lit wonderland of blue books, guides to the brothels, opulent mansions, and cheap cribs. But Storyville's true legacy was not sex, it was sound. The brothels and dance halls needed entertainment. It was in this red light district that the musical traditions of the century collided. The sophisticated reading ability of the Creole musicians met the improvisational blues of the uptown Americans. The military brass instruments left over from the Civil War were picked up by geniuses like Buddy Bolden. They began to play a music that was syncopated, hot, and collective. It didn't have a name yet, but it was the birth cry of jazz. Epilogue, The Soul of the Century. By midnight on New Year's Eve, 1899, New Orleans was a city worn down by 100 years of struggle. It had survived transfer between empires, invasion, fire, flood, plague, and war. It had been the richest city in America and had been brought to its knees. The 1800s did not leave New Orleans with a booming industrial economy like Chicago or a financial empire like New York. Instead, it left something more durable. The pressure cooker of the 19th century, the mixing of French, Spanish, African, and American cultures, had distilled a spirit that was unique in the world. The city had learned that life is fragile, so it must be celebrated. It had learned that history is heavy, so it must be danced away. As the 20th century dawned, the cotton ships were fewer, but the music rising from the streets was just beginning to catch the wind. New Orleans had survived its history to become a legend.